Lecture 13. Causation, Possible Worlds, and Propositions.
We are now at the halfway point. So far, we have confined our discussion to topics relevant to the nature of persons, the nature of the mind, the persistence of personal identity, and free will. But the metaphysician is also concerned with the nature of reality in general. First of all, we want to know what we should include in our ontology, that is, our list of everything that exists. We will assume the universe exists, although epistemologists sometimes challenge our ability to have such knowledge. But since that is an epistemological matter, we will leave such questions aside. However, even though the metaphysician assumes the existence of the universe, we still wonder about its true nature. It supposedly consists of matter, but what is the nature of matter? Is it all made up of tiny particles? And if so, what is the nature of those particles? And what about the space between those particles? Is that a substance in which objects sit? And what about time? Is it a substance in which objects move forward? If so, is it possible to move backwards in time? Is time travel possible? And what does it mean for something to exist in the first place? Our examination of these matters may reveal that the very nature of existence is not what we intuitively think it is. The metaphysician also wonders whether or not anything else exists besides or outside of the universe. This leads us to questions about God's existence since, well, at least according to many, if God exists, he would exist outside of our universe. But it also leads to questions about whether or not there are universes outside the one that we inhabit. In other words, are there multiple universes? Interestingly, our explorations into the nature of our universe may reveal that the existence of alternative universes is highly likely. But God and other universes are not the only things that philosophers suspect may exist beyond our physical universe. There are a few candidates, in fact. So, before we start talking about God, the nature of our universe, and the possibility of other universes, I want to take you on a philosophical journey through questions about the nature of causation, an issue of particular interest to metaphysicians. Not only is this necessary before we talk about quantum mechanics, which will unintuitively suggest that some events happen without causes, but along the way, the journey will reveal that many other things may exist beyond our universe. Causation is one of those things that everyone thinks they understand, but few have actually ever put any thought into. What does it mean to suggest that one thing, A, is the cause of some other thing, B? You can't merely mean that A comes right before B. There are plenty of examples of one thing following the other where the two things are not causally related. For example, the administration of the MMR vaccine sometimes comes before the event of a child displaying symptoms of autism. But, despite the claims of some conspiracy theorists, we know there is no causal link. Studies have been done showing that there is no correlation between vaccines and autism. It just happens to be the case that the age that a child's immune system is developed enough to receive vaccines is close to the age at which they would start displaying signs of autism if they have it. But even if there was a correlation, that would not necessarily imply a causal connection. A logical fallacy that you will find in every critical thinking textbook is the causal fallacy. The textbooks rightly point out that correlation does not necessarily imply causation. Sometimes the correlation is due, not to causation, but a common third factor, like the example we had before where age caused a correlation between shoe size and reading ability. But other times it's just a coincidence. A fun, and actually true example, is that there is a direct correlation between the housing bubble that caused the 2008 economic crash and the number of babies named Ava. The housing price index increased right alongside the number of babies named Ava, peaking in 2008, and then both steadily declined afterwards. But obviously, one did not cause the other. So when we say two things are causally related, we can't merely mean that one came before the other or that they are correlated. So, what exactly does causation amount to? The philosopher David Hume suggested that a causal relation between two things amounted to a necessary connection between those two things. The presence of one would guarantee the presence of the other. That would mean not only is it the case that every time A has occurred, B followed, but every time A will occur, B will follow. But how could we know that two events are necessarily connected in this way? A quote-unquote necessary connection is not something that we can observe. All we can see with our eyes is a correlation. We cannot look into the future and see whether or not every time A will occur, B will follow. Now you might think that we can know that B will always follow A because B always has followed A. But, Hume points out, such an inference relies on induction, a method of reasoning that infers what the future will be like from what the past was like. But, Hume argues, we cannot prove that such reasoning is reliable. Any argument we gave in its favor would have to utilize the fact that such reasoning has worked in the past and conclude from that it will work in the future. But such an argument utilizes the very method of reasoning that it's trying to prove, and thus the argument is no good. It just argues in a circle. This is Hume's famous problem of induction. Richard Taylor, in the 4th edition of his book Metaphysics, defines causation in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. Roughly put, according to Taylor, A was the cause of B just means that A was sufficient for the occurrence of B and B could not have occurred without A. Now on face, this presents a difficulty. For example, when I use a lighter to light my barbecue grill in the backyard, clearly the ignition of the lighter causes the ignition of the grill. Yet, the ignition of the lighter is not necessary for the ignition of the grill. I could have lit it with a match, or even a blowtorch. Although Taylor does not deny this, in anticipation of this problem, he restricts his definition so that it describes what is necessary and sufficient given what actually occurred. So while it is true that I could have lit my grill with a match, in this particular instance I didn't. I lit it with a lighter. And so it's true in this situation that the event of the lighter igniting caused the event of the grill lighting. Why? Because, according to Taylor's definition, if I were to subtract the lighter and only the lighter, but leave everything else the same, the grill would not have lit. The lighter was the necessary and sufficient condition in the situation that actually occurred. Other conditions, like the color of my shirt, were not necessary or sufficient for the ignition of the grill. Change the color of my shirt, and the grill would still light. This seems to be a good definition. The lighter ignited the grill because propositions like this are true. The ignition of the lighter was sufficient and necessary in those conditions for the ignition of the grill. The color of my shirt did not causally contribute to the ignition of the grill because propositions like this are true. It is possible that the color of my shirt was different, and yet the grill still ignited. But now we wonder, what does it mean for something to be possible or necessary? What makes such propositions true? Statements about possibility and necessity are called modal statements. You might wonder why their truth is controversial, but let's think about it. Take this statement. Mitt Romney could have won the 2012 election. We think this statement is true. We can no longer change the past, but the state of affairs of Romney winning the 2012 election is a possible state of affairs. But what makes that true? Recall, the correspondence theory of truth requires the truth of propositions to have an explanation, to have a truth maker. The fact that Barack Obama won the 2012 election does have a truth maker, the past event of Obama winning the election. But what makes it true that Romney could have won the election? What makes that possible? Since Romney did not win the election in the real world, it doesn't seem that we can point to any state of affairs in the real world to find a truth maker for this modal statement. We might be tempted to say it's true because if people had voted differently, he would have won. But that only follows if people could have voted differently than they did. And they could have voted differently only if such a thing is possible. So we are once again wondering what it means for something to be possible, and thus we're right back to wondering about modal statements. To answer these questions about modal statements, philosophers introduced the notion of possible worlds. Although they probably shouldn't have called them possible worlds, but possible realities, because we're not just talking about the Earth. A possible world represents a different way that all of reality could have gone. So imagine a universe that is exactly like ours, except there was one difference. Let's say your shirt is a different color. That is a possible world. Imagine a universe where two things are different. Your shirt is a different color and you're not wearing shoes. That is a possible world. Imagine a universe where life never evolved and there are no conscious beings. That is a possible world. For any given way the universe could have gone, there is a possible world in which it went that way. But it actually goes a little further than that. Possible worlds are not merely alternate universes. Possible worlds are descriptions of an entire reality, not just a universe. There is a possible world that contains only one universe, such that the only difference between that universe and ours is that you're wearing a different color shirt. But there is also a possible world that contains both a universe where the only difference is you are wearing a different colored shirt, and another universe where the only difference is that you're not wearing shoes. A possible world can contain one universe, or two, or three, or even an infinite amount. In short, some possible worlds consist of one universe, and some possible worlds are multiverses. So we can't think of possible worlds merely as alternate universes. So what philosophers suggest that modal statements amount to is statements about possible worlds. Romney could have won the 2012 election just means there is a possible world in which Romney won the 2012 election. People could have voted differently amounts to there is a possible world in which people did vote differently. But recall, we are looking for truth makers for modal statements. Non-modal statements, like the bottle is on the table, are made true by real existing states of affairs. I can point to a piece of the world and say, that is what makes the bottle is on the table true. So if possible worlds are going to serve as truth makers for modal statements, must they exist like states of affairs exist? The philosopher David Lewis suggests that they must. If we think something serves as a truth maker for a proposition, we must include it in our ontology. We must think that it exists. Recall that we saw this before when we were trying to find truth makers for propositions about the past and the future. We concluded that we must think that the future and past events exist to serve as truth makers for such propositions. Lewis suggests that we have to say the same thing about possible worlds. If we are going to say that possible worlds serve as truth makers for modal propositions, we have to include them in our ontology. We must think that they exist. Now, when we talked about including future and past events in our ontology, we drew a distinction between their existence and their occurrence. The fact that I am committed to believing a future event exists does not commit me to believing that it is presently occurring. Lewis suggests that, when it comes to possible worlds, we draw a distinction between existence and being actual. The fact that a possible world exists does not mean that it is actual. The only possible world that we can say is actual is our own. The other worlds exist, but they are merely possible. Now, some philosophers stop there, but David Lewis goes even further. He suggests that those other worlds not only exist, but are, we might say, just as real as our own. They have an equal ontological status to our own. Sure, they're merely possible, but to beings in those worlds, our world is merely possible. To them, their world is actual. At least according to Lewis, he is a realist about possible worlds. You can think about a world's actuality in terms of time zones. When it's 11 o'clock Eastern, it's 10 o'clock Central. Two people can say different things about what time it is, and both of them can be right. What time it is relative to time zone. In the same way, you and a person in a different possible world can say different things about which world is actual, and you can both be right. Whether a world is actual is relative to the world itself. In a similar manner, a person who exists in a future moment and says, this is the present moment, is correct. Every moment is the present moment in its own time frame. In the same way, according to Lewis, every possible world is the actual world according to its own frame of reference. As you can imagine, not all philosophers are friendly to this idea. Since there is an infinite number of ways the world could have turned out, there would be an infinite number of possible worlds. Philosophers don't like to suppose that things exist when they don't have to, and an infinite number of possible worlds is a lot of things to suppose exist. But possible world semantics is a very useful way to make sense of modal statements. So is there any way to preserve its meaning without such a, what we might call a bloated ontology? There are a number of attempts to do so. Let me give you what I think is the easiest example. Consider every possible proposition, every possible combination of words that makes logical sense or is meaningful. Now, every one of those propositions is either true or it's false. It either accurately describes the way the world is or it doesn't. I want you to imagine this giant set of propositions and the truth values they would have given the way our world actually is. Now, place all the true ones on the left and then all the false ones on the right. Have you got it? Good. Let's call this an arrangement of the set of all propositions. This happens to be the arrangement that corresponds to the way the world actually is. Now, in your mind's eye, I want you to rearrange these propositions, shifting them around, but I want you to do so in a logically consistent manner. Now, what does that mean? Well, any proposition that expresses a logical contradiction would be on the right with all the other false propositions. But since logical contradictions can't be true, you'll never be able to move it over to the left with the true propositions. In the same way, any proposition that expresses a tautology, something that must be true, like 2 + 2 = 4, will have to stay on the left. In addition, we know that for any given proposition that is true, its exact opposite must be false. And if it is false, its opposite must be true. So if you're going to rearrange the set of all propositions in a logically consistent way, if you move one from the right to the left, you'll have to move its opposite from the left to the right. And you will also have to move any other propositions that are logically related to it. So let's take the arrangement of all propositions that corresponds to the actual world. Now, let's say you're going to rearrange it and move the Obama won the 2012 election proposition from the left to the right. That means you're going to have to move the Obama lost the 2012 election proposition from the right to the left. This will also require you to move some other propositions around, either propositions that express how people voted or how election results are tallied. That new arrangement of propositions corresponds to some possible world. In fact, we might say that it is a possible world. Instead of thinking of possible worlds as actually existing entities, we could think of a possible world as a logically consistent arrangement of all propositions. Let's make that our non-realist view of possible worlds. But if possible worlds are arrangements of propositions, now we wonder, what exactly is a proposition? It's not the same thing as a sentence, like a written utterance. Sentences express propositions, but they are not identical to propositions. Think about the sentence, "The bottle is on the table." That expresses a proposition, a notion, that is not identical to the sentence itself. I could express the same proposition in a different language. I could even express the same proposition with a different sentence. The table is under and in direct contact with the bottle. Some propositions are never expressed. So what exactly is a proposition supposed to be? But if possible worlds are collections of propositions, now we wonder, what exactly is a proposition? It's not the same thing as a sentence. Sentences express propositions, but they're not identical to propositions. Think about the sentence, "The bottle is on the table." That expresses a proposition, a notion that is not identical to the sentence itself. I could express the same proposition in a different language. I could even express the same proposition with a different sentence. The table is under and in direct contact with the bottle. And some propositions are never expressed. So what exactly is a proposition supposed to be? Propositions have truth values, and they are either true or false in virtue of whether or not they correspond to the world, whether they accurately describe the way the world is. But how can something have a truth value and describe the world if it does not exist in some sense? But you can't find propositions in the world, so if propositions exist but are not in the world, well then what the hell are they? It is problems like this that have driven philosophers to think of propositions as abstract objects, non-physical entities. Like souls, they're not made of matter, but unlike souls, they are not made of anything else. They're not a substance. They do not causally influence the world, so no weird problems of downwards causation emerge here like they did with souls. But still, the idea of abstract objects is a bit strange. But it's not a new idea. The first abstract objects most likely belong to Plato. Although belong is probably a strong word, he didn't own them. He did hypothesize them, however. Plato wondered how it could be that two different objects with extremely different properties could be the same thing. Imagine a chair that you might sit in at school or the office and one you might recline in at home. These two objects are very different, and yet we consider them both a chair. Why? Plato would say because they both participate in the form of chair. Plato imagined a non-physical realm, kind of like heaven, where perfect versions of physical objects existed, like chairs. The chairs in the real world are chairs because they resemble the form of a chair that exists in this realm. And we recognize both the office chair, the school desk, and the recliner as chairs because we are somehow familiar with the form of the chair. Plato thought there were forms for everything: tables, people, justice, virtue, and his favorite, the form of the good. Modern philosophers still debate about such things, but in a slightly different way. The nature of properties is of considerable interest. For example, a ruby and an apple seem to share something, the color of red. But what exactly is a color? Both the apple and the ruby exist in different places, yet the same color is possessed by both? We don't want to deny that colors are real, but how can the same color be two places at once? No individual entity that exists in the universe can be two places at once. So, some philosophers argue, colors must not be individual entities that exist in the universe, they must be like forms, non-physical, abstract entities that exist outside the universe, but that can be possessed by individuals in the universe. And this would be true for any property. Philosophers call such entities universals. Although you can see when an individual possesses a universal, the universal itself is unobservable. But believing in the existence of unobservable things is not unprecedented. Subatomic particles cannot be observed, but scientists have no problem thinking that they exist because hypothesizing their existence is the best way to explain our observations. In the same way, some philosophers think that the existence of universals is the best way to resolve philosophical problems. Thus, they have no problem hypothesizing their existence. For example, in the sentence, "the apple is red," we know exactly what the word apple refers to, but what does the word red refer to? A realist theory of universals, which suggests that universals actually exist, gives us a nice answer to that question. But it probably goes without saying that some philosophers don't agree. They don't like hypothesizing the existence of strange, abstract entities and think that the philosophical problems can be solved without them. Some philosophers want to account for properties by grouping objects into sets, where all the members of the set resemble each other. But of course, it's difficult to account for resemblance without reference to properties. Others suggest that objects consist of tropes, individual instances of properties that are not shared by any other object, and that resemblance between objects can be accounted for in terms of possessing tropes of resemblance. But ultimately, to make sense of their theory, trope theorists have to appeal to brute facts, and so it's not clear how much explaining such a theory does. Conceptualists suggest that properties exist, but not as mind-independent entities, but instead as concepts or ideas in our minds. Two objects are red because the idea or concept of red applies to both. But of course, it's difficult to define when an idea is properly applied to an object and when it isn't, without appealing to brute facts about properties or resemblance. But I mentioned universals and abstract objects to give you an idea of what an abstract object is. Some philosophers think of propositions as abstract objects. But if we are articulating our ontology, our list of everything that exists, we would have to include any abstract objects that we believe exist. So, if you believe propositions are abstract objects, you would have to include them in your ontology. But recall, I gave an account of possible worlds in terms of propositions. And I did this because some philosophers don't like the idea of possible worlds being real existent objects. They didn't want to include them in their ontology. They thought it made their ontology too bloated. But if a possible world is a logically consistent arrangement of all propositions, and propositions are abstract objects, and you have to include abstract objects in your ontology, it's not clear that conceiving of possible worlds as sets of propositions solves anything. It still gives us a bloated ontology. Some might argue that having abstract objects like propositions in your ontology is not as bad as having entire possible worlds in your ontology, but I'm not sure how convincing such arguments would be. Some philosophers go the opposite direction and try to eliminate propositions from their ontology by using possible worlds. They figure if we're already committed to believing in possible worlds to make sense of modal statements, why can't we just use them to solve our questions about propositions too? They suggest that a proposition just is the set of all possible worlds in which that proposition is true. Regardless, it's undeniable that possible worlds solve all kinds of philosophical problems, which again is at least some reason for thinking they exist. Which brings us back around to causation. David Lewis suggests that possible worlds can very easily solve the philosophical problems that surround causation. Recall, earlier we suggested that we can understand causation in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, but we weren't sure how to make sense of these modal concepts. Possible world semantics allows us to do just that. Lewis suggests that we develop a concept of what it means for one possible world to be quote-unquote closer or more similar to another. A possible world where everything is the same, but I'm wearing a different color shirt, is very close to the actual world. A possible world where life doesn't exist or the laws of physics are different is very different than the actual world. With this in mind, Lewis suggests that we can make sense of causation using possible worlds. What makes it true that the ignition of my lighter caused the ignition of my barbecue grill? Lewis asks us to imagine two possible worlds that differ from our own in regard to whether or not the supposed cause, the ignition of the lighter, and the effect, the ignition of my grill, occur. Imagine a world that contains all the same events as the actual world, except I don't ignite my lighter and the grill does not ignite. And then compare that with the world that contains all the same events where I don't ignite my lighter, but the grill still ignites. Which of those two worlds is closer to the actual world where my lighter ignites and the grill ignites? The first world, where neither ignite, is a little bit different, but not a lot. It doesn't contain those two events, but that's really the only difference. The second world, where I don't ignite my lighter, but the grill still ignites, would be quite a different world. Recall, all the other events in that world are exactly the same. I don't use a match or a blowtorch or anything else to light the grill. In order for the grill to light without the ignition of my lighter, and yet no other events in that world be different, the laws of physics would have to be different. That would be a world where an absence of fire would serve as an ignition source. This is quite a different world indeed. According to Lewis, an event A causes an event B when it is the case that the world where A doesn't occur but B still occurs is radically different from our own compared to a world where neither occur. Notice this also makes sense of why two things are not causally related. A world where the only difference is I wear a different color shirt while I use the lighter and the grill ignites is not that different from the actual world. Lewis's theory, of course, has been subjected to objections, but we'll have to save those for a graduate level course. But as we've explored the concept of causation, we have seen many reasons for thinking that possible worlds exist and explored the concept of an abstract object. I'm not saying that such things exist, but I am suggesting that to do so isn't crazy. They are very philosophically useful. And as metaphysics goes, as an exploration about the very nature of reality, these are about as metaphysical questions can get. But now we shall turn our attention to something else that might exist outside of our world. God. What exactly is God supposed to be? And are there any good reasons for thinking that God exists? We will start with the former question next lecture.